On the morning of her son's wedding, Margaret Whitmore woke up bald. She did not scream when she saw the pillow dusted with strands of silver. She did not rush to the door or call the front desk. She simply sat there in the quiet suite at the Napa Valley Inn, listening to the distant hum of delivery trucks setting up white folding chairs on the lawn below. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, soft and golden, the kind of California morning people paid thousands of dollars to photograph. Margaret lifted her hand slowly and touched her head. What had once been a long curtain of silver hair, carefully brushed the night before, was now uneven, jagged, reduced to a thin, choppy layer that exposed far more scalp than it concealed. She stood and walked to the bathroom, her bare feet steady against the cool marble tile. The mirror did not lie. It showed a 68-year-old woman in a silk robe, shoulders squared, eyes clear, and hair nearly gone. She studied her reflection the way she used to study financial reports when she and her late husband ran their insurance agency. Calm, methodical, no sign of panic. The door to the suite had remained locked all night. She remembered checking it herself before turning in. The only visitor she had received was Olivia, her future daughter-in-law, who had stopped by around 9:30 with a glass of sparkling water and a bright, careful smile. "Just wanted to make sure you're resting," Olivia had said, stepping inside without fully waiting for an invitation. Margaret had noticed then how Olivia's gaze lingered on her hair, the long silver waves that fell halfway down her back. Several guests at the rehearsal dinner had complimented it, calling it elegant, calling it striking. Olivia had laughed lightly and said, "It photographs a little harsh in sunlight, but we'll make it work." Margaret had smiled at the time. Now she replayed the tone. Too polished, too smooth. She turned on the faucet and let the water run, watching the strands collected in the sink drift toward the drain. She reached for a hand towel and gently wiped the counter clean, as if tidying up after an ordinary morning routine. Outside, she could hear laughter from the courtyard, bridesmaids moving between rooms, someone testing the string quartet near the vineyard rose. The schedule for the day had been printed on thick ivory cardstock. Ceremony at 4 o'clock, cocktail hour at 5. Reception to follow beneath a canopy of lights strung between oak trees. Margaret had contributed to every detail. The venue deposit, the catering bill, the custom monogram napkins. She had written checks without hesitation because Daniel was her only child, and she wanted his day to be flawless. She picked up her phone and checked the time. 8:15 a.m. Plenty of hours before the ceremony. Enough time for a stylist, if she chose. Enough time to cancel everything, if she wished. Instead, she opened her contacts and scrolled past Daniel's name. She did not call him. Not yet. Her reflection stared back at her, stripped of its familiar frame of silver. She tilted her head slightly, assessing angles the way photographers would later that afternoon. She reached into her suitcase and pulled out a silk scarf she had packed for the evening chill, ivory with a faint blue border. She folded it carefully and wrapped it around her head, smoothing the fabric with deliberate precision. The woman in the mirror did not look defeated. She looked composed. Margaret Whitmore had spent 40 years building a life from nothing but discipline and quiet resolve. A missing crown of hair would not be the thing that broke her. Downstairs, a door closed softly in the hallway. Footsteps passed by her suite. Somewhere nearby, Olivia's laughter rang out, light and confident. Margaret adjusted the scarf once more, then reached for her phone again, this time selecting a different contact. If someone believed this morning would humiliate her into silence, they had underestimated her. She had hours before 4 o'clock, and she intended to use every single one of them. Margaret waited until the hallway grew quiet before stepping outside her suite, the silk scarf tied neatly at the nape of her neck and her posture as straight as it had been the day she buried her husband 12 years earlier. The vineyard stretched beyond the courtyard in neat green rows, dew still clinging to the leaves under the mild 70-degree morning sun. Guests were beginning to gather in clusters near the white pergola where the ceremony would take place, holding paper cups of coffee and speaking in low, excited voices. A few of them glanced at Margaret as she crossed the stone path, their eyes lingering on the scarf but quickly sliding away out of politeness. She offered each of them a measured smile, the kind that revealed nothing. Inside the main reception hall, florists were arranging ivory roses into tall glass vases, and the scent of fresh greenery filled the air. Margaret paused near the entrance and took in the scene she had financed down to the last detail, from the imported table linens to the live jazz trio scheduled for the evening. It had been her idea to host the wedding in Napa, a place Daniel had loved since childhood when they used to drive through Northern California on summer road trips in their old station wagon. She remembered him at 8 years old, leaning out the window to feel the warm breeze, asking questions about how grapes became wine. Back then he had looked at her as if she could explain anything. She wondered when that look had faded. A flash of white caught her eye across the room. Olivia stood near the staircase, dressed in a satin robe embroidered with her new initials, surrounded by bridesmaids who fluttered around her with curling irons and makeup brushes. Olivia laughed at something one of them said, her voice bright and untroubled. For a brief moment her gaze met Margaret's. The laughter paused. Her eyes dropped to the scarf, then lifted again with a carefully constructed expression of concern. She excused herself from her friends and walked over in small, precise steps. "Margaret, are you feeling all right?" she asked softly, as though speaking to someone fragile. Margaret held her gaze. "I slept fine," she replied evenly. "The air conditioning in these rooms can be unpredictable." Olivia nodded too quickly. "You know, if you need a stylist, I can have mine come by. We want everything to look perfect for the photographs." The word perfect lingered between them. Margaret considered the offer, then shook her head. "I have already arranged what I need." She did not elaborate. Olivia's smile thinned at the edges before returning to its polished shape. "Of course," she said. "Today is about family." Margaret watched her walk away, heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She did not miss the subtle tension in Olivia's shoulders or the way she whispered something to a bridesmaid, who glanced back at Margaret with poorly concealed curiosity. Margaret stepped outside again and moved toward a quiet bench, beneath an old oak tree that overlooked the ceremony space. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap, breathing in the scent of earth and fresh-cut grass. Her phone rested in her purse, a single message sent earlier that morning already acknowledged with a brief response, "On my way." She did not rush. She had learned long ago that urgency often benefited the wrong person. The guests would soon take their seats in rows aligned with mathematical precision, unaware of the silent shift unfolding beneath the surface of the day. Margaret's reflection in a nearby window showed a woman composed and steady, her scarf framing her face like a deliberate choice rather than a necessity. If Olivia believed this morning would render her small, she would discover before sunset that she had miscalculated the kind of woman she had chosen to test. By late morning the vineyard had transformed into a carefully orchestrated celebration, rows of white chairs aligned with flawless symmetry and a string quartet, rehearsing a soft arrangement of canon in D beneath the wooden arbor. Margaret remained seated beneath the oak tree for several minutes after Olivia returned to the bridal suite, watching staff members adjust ribbons and wipe down already spotless tables. At 10:45 her phone vibrated once. She did not look startled. She simply opened her purse and read the message before rising to her feet. A dark sedan rolled slowly into the circular driveway near the reception hall, understated and deliberate. The man who stepped out wore a navy suit despite the warming 78-degree sun, his briefcase carried with quiet purpose. Thomas Green had handled the Whitmore family's legal affairs for more than 20 years. He had drafted wills, structured investments, and navigated the paperwork after Margaret's husband passed away. When he approached her beneath the shade of the oak tree, he did not comment on her scarf. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He handed her a small envelope and spoke in a low, even tone. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged except for the faint narrowing of her eyes as she absorbed each detail. Across the lawn, a pair of bridesmaids stepped outside for photographs and noticed the exchange. One of them leaned closer to the other, whispering behind manicured fingers. The scene would have looked ordinary to anyone else, an older woman reviewing paperwork, before her son's wedding. But the timing was precise. Margaret had requested something specific early that morning after reviewing the security features of the hotel. The maintained hallway cameras on every floor, footage stored digitally for 30 days. Thomas had already spoken with management and secured a copy of the recording from the corridor outside Margaret's suite between midnight and 3 a.m. The envelope now resting in her hand contained a flash drive no larger than her thumb. She did not open it. She did not need to. She had seen enough patterns in her lifetime to understand probability. She thanked Thomas with a slight nod and gave one clear instruction. He responded with the same calm professionalism he had always shown her and returned to his car without drawing further attention. Margaret slipped the envelope into her purse and walked back toward the main hall. Inside, the energy had intensified. Makeup artists moved briskly. A photographer adjusted lighting equipment near a tall window. Daniel stood near the bar with his best man, checking his watch and laughing at something said in low confidence. He looked handsome in his tailored charcoal suit, his shoulders broad, his posture relaxed. For a moment Margaret paused at the doorway and allowed herself to see him not as a groom, but as the boy who once clung to her hand on his first day of kindergarten. He caught sight of her and waved, a quick, affectionate gesture. She lifted her hand in return, the silk scarf catching the light like a deliberate accessory rather than a concealment. He did not yet notice what lay beneath it. Why would he? Olivia emerged at the top of the staircase. Her white gown fitted perfectly, her veil cascading down her back like a waterfall of lace. Applause rippled lightly through the room as she descended. Her gaze swept across the crowd until it found Margaret again. This time there was a flicker of uncertainty, almost imperceptible but present. Margaret held her eyes steadily, neither smiling nor frowning. Somewhere beyond the music and the polished laughter, an invisible line had been drawn. The ceremony would begin in a few hours. Before that moment arrived, the truth resting inside Margaret's purse would be positioned exactly where it needed to be. The afternoon light shifted gradually across the vineyard, turning the rows of grapevines a deeper shade of green. As guests began taking their seats beneath the arbor, a gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and citrus blossoms, and the hum of conversation blended with the soft tuning of violins. Margaret stood near the back of the seating area, one hand resting lightly on her purse, the silk scarf framing her face with deliberate elegance. From a distance she appeared composed, even distinguished, as though the scarf had always been part of her plan for the day. Daniel moved through the crowd greeting relatives from out of state, shaking hands, and accepting congratulations with an easy smile. He paused when he reached his mother. His eyes lingered for a brief second longer than usual. "You look different," he said carefully, searching her expression. Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "I am simply adjusting to the weather," she replied evenly. "It is warmer than expected." He nodded, distracted by the rising anticipation of the ceremony, and was quickly called away by his best man. Margaret watched him step toward the front row, unaware of the silent current running beneath the celebration. A few rows ahead, Olivia stood with her bridesmaids for final photographs. The lace of her gown shimmered under the afternoon sun, and her smile radiated practiced confidence. Yet every so often her eyes flicked toward Margaret, measuring, calculating. Margaret did not look away. At precisely 3:45, Thomas Green reappeared near the sound equipment station set up beside the arbor. He spoke briefly with the event coordinator, a polite exchange that appeared entirely administrative. No one paid close attention. Weddings required last-minute adjustments all the time. A microphone was tested. A small speaker was repositioned. The flash drive inside Margaret's purse felt weightless, yet its presence steadied her like an anchor. She had not viewed the footage herself. She did not need the emotional impact. She relied on clarity, not shock. The officiant took his place at the front, adjusting his tie as the string quartet began the processional. Guests rose in unison, programs rustling like quiet waves. Margaret remained standing with them, her back straight, her chin lifted. When Olivia appeared at the aisle, escorted by her father, a murmur of admiration swept through the crowd. She looked radiant, composed, every detail meticulously arranged. As she reached the altar and took her position beside Daniel, her gaze briefly searched the audience again. It landed on Margaret and held there a fraction longer than comfort allowed. The ceremony unfolded with familiar vows about partnership, loyalty, and trust, words that carried weight, even when spoken in celebration. Margaret listened carefully, not with bitterness, but with measured attention. When the officiant invited the guests to be seated, she lowered herself gracefully into the front row. The envelope inside her purse remained unopened, yet its purpose was nearing. This moment was not about disruption. It was about timing. As Daniel and Olivia exchanged rings, Sunlight caught the edge of Margaret's scarf, illuminating the pale silk against her calm expression. Around her, guests smiled, some wiping away sentimental tears. They saw a proud mother witnessing her son begin a new chapter. They did not see the quiet resolve forming behind her steady eyes. The ceremony concluded with applause and a celebratory kiss, cameras flashing in quick succession. As the couple turned to walk back down the aisle, Thomas moved discreetly toward the reception hall ahead of the crowd. Margaret rose with everyone else, clapping politely, her expression unchanged. The reception would begin within the hour. Speeches were scheduled. Microphones would be passed from hand to hand. And when the time arrived, the truth would not shout. It would simply appear, undeniable and clear, in a room that had gathered to celebrate unity. The reception hall glowed under strands of warm white lights draped across the ceiling like a quiet constellation, and the late afternoon sun filtered through tall windows overlooking the vineyard. Round tables dressed in ivory linen filled the room, each centerpiece rising in elegant arrangements of roses and eucalyptus that Margaret had personally approved months earlier. Guests moved between cocktail hour and their assigned seats, balancing glasses of sparkling water and champagne, while a jazz trio played softly near the dance floor. Margaret entered with measured steps, her silk scarf still perfectly arranged, her expression calm enough to pass for simple maternal pride. A few relatives approached to compliment the ceremony, commenting on how beautiful everything looked. She thanked them graciously, her voice steady, her smile controlled. When Daniel and Olivia were announced into the reception, applause filled the room. They stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance, moving slowly beneath the glow of string lights while cameras flashed from every angle. Margaret watched from her table at the front, her posture straight, her hands folded lightly over her purse. She did not avert her eyes. She observed. When the music ended and dinner was served, conversations rose and fell in gentle waves. Plates of herb-roasted chicken and seasonal vegetables were placed before guests, and waitstaff moved with practiced efficiency between tables. Margaret ate very little. At precisely 6:30, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone and invited the father of the bride to give his toast. It was warm, sentimental, filled with stories from Olivia's childhood. Laughter followed. Then Daniel's best man spoke, recalling college memories and praising loyalty and friendship. Applause echoed again. The master of ceremonies smiled toward Margaret's table. And now, the groom's mother would like to share a few words. A subtle hush spread across the room. Margaret rose smoothly, adjusting her scarf once before walking toward the microphone. Each step was unhurried. The wooden floor beneath her heels sounded deliberate but not loud. She accepted the microphone and turned to face the room filled with friends, relatives, and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate unity. Her voice, when she began, was clear and steady. She spoke about Daniel as a child, about the first time he rode a bicycle without training wheels, about the way he used to insist on holding her hand while crossing the street even after he was tall enough not to need it. Gentle laughter rippled through the guests. She spoke of love as a choice, not just a feeling, and of respect as the foundation of every lasting bond. Her tone remained composed, almost reflective. Olivia watched her carefully from the sweetheart table, a smile fixed in place, yet no longer effortless. Margaret paused briefly, as if collecting a final thought. This morning, she continued, her eyes scanning the room, I was reminded that trust is fragile. It can be strengthened by honesty or weakened by secrecy. A faint tension settled over the nearest tables. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize her words. She simply turned her head slightly toward the sound technician near the back of the hall and gave a small nod. Moments later, the large projection screen behind the couple flickered to life. At first it displayed a still image of the vineyard corridor. Then the timestamp appeared in the corner. The room grew quiet as footage began to play, showing a hallway outside a hotel suite in the early hours of the morning. Margaret stood beside the microphone without speaking further, her gaze forward, her composure unbroken, while the truth began to unfold in silence before everyone who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was a perfect beginning. The screen behind the sweetheart table glowed against the dimmed reception lights, and the soft clinking of silverware faded into absolute silence as the timestamp in the corner of the footage shifted from 1 minute to the next. The hallway outside Margaret's hotel suite appeared empty at first, the carpeted corridor lit by recessed ceiling lights that cast long, quiet shadows. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, uncertain whether this was a sentimental slideshow or something else entirely. Daniel turned halfway in his seat, confusion replacing the easy smile he had worn moments earlier. Olivia remained very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture rigid beneath layers of satin and lace. On the screen, at 2:17 in the morning, a familiar figure stepped into view. The angle was clear enough to recognize the outline of a bridal robe and carefully styled hair pulled back from the face. The figure paused outside Margaret's door, glanced once down the hallway, and then used a key card to enter the suite. A quiet ripple moved through the room like wind across tall grass. No one spoke. The footage continued without commentary, showing the same figure exiting the room 12 minutes later, adjusting the robe, and walking briskly back toward the elevators. The screen froze on that final frame. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not look at Olivia immediately. She simply faced the audience and allowed the silence to settle fully before speaking again. "Trust," she said calmly into the microphone, "is not proven in public vows. It is proven in private actions." Her words were not sharp. They were measured. Daniel slowly stood from his chair, eyes fixed on the screen as though replaying the last 24 hours in his mind. He looked at Olivia, searching her expression for explanation. She rose as well, her composure faltering just enough to reveal strain beneath the surface. "It was a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her voice carrying through the stillness without the aid of a microphone. "I only went to check on her." Margaret turned her gaze toward her for the first time since the video began. There was no anger in her expression, only clarity. "At 2:17 in the morning," she replied evenly, "with a key card that was not issued to you." A murmur spread across the tables, restrained but unmistakable. The event coordinator stood frozen near the sound system, unsure whether to intervene. Daniel stepped closer to Olivia, lowering his voice, yet the tension in his posture was visible from every corner of the room. Margaret placed the microphone back on its stand with deliberate care. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. The evidence had spoken without embellishment. Thomas Green stood quietly near the back of the hall, observing, his presence subtle yet grounding. Margaret looked once more at her son, holding his gaze steadily. There was disappointment there, but not weakness. The silk scarf caught the light as she turned away from the microphone and returned to her table. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others watching Daniel and Olivia with restrained disbelief. The celebration that had filled the room only minutes earlier now felt suspended, fragile. Margaret sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She had not shouted. She had not humiliated. She had simply revealed. Around her, the music remained silent, the dance floor empty, the air heavy with the realization that the beginning of a marriage had just been tested by truth before it had truly begun. No one resumed their seat immediately. The silence did not shatter into chaos, nor did it dissolve into polite laughter. It lingered, thick and undeniable, pressing against every white tablecloth and crystal glass in the room. Daniel stood between the projection screen and the sweetheart table, his jaw set, his eyes moving from the frozen image on the wall to Olivia's face. She attempted to speak again, her voice softer now, less certain. She insisted she had only wanted to surprise Margaret with a small gesture, that things had been misunderstood, that the timing looked worse than it was. Her words floated in the air without landing. Daniel did not respond right away. He turned instead toward his mother, who remained seated with her hands folded calmly in her lap. The silk scarf framed her face like a quiet crown, her expression composed, neither triumphant nor wounded. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate across the polished wooden floor. Guests parted slightly to give him space, their eyes following him in restrained anticipation. When he reached her table, he lowered himself into the chair beside her. From across the room, Olivia watched, her posture rigid, her bouquet resting untouched near her plate. Daniel leaned closer to Margaret and spoke in a low tone that did not carry beyond their table. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. Whatever he asked, she answered simply, without embellishment. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Only quiet clarity. After a moment, Daniel straightened and exhaled slowly, as though something inside him had shifted beyond denial. He stood again and faced the room. The guests looked back at him, uncertain whether to clap, to leave, or to remain frozen in place. The master of ceremonies held the microphone but did not dare speak. Daniel walked back toward Olivia. She reached for his hand instinctively, but he did not immediately take it. Instead, he searched her face, as if hoping to find a version of her he recognized from months before. The music had not resumed. The string lights above the dance floor glowed warmly, indifferent to human tension. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice controlled but firm enough to carry across the nearest tables. He said that marriage required honesty before celebration, and that some conversations could not wait for a honeymoon. He did not accuse publicly. He did not humiliate. He simply stated that the reception would pause. A murmur spread again, softer this time, more reflective than shocked. Olivia's shoulders lowered slightly, as though the weight of public certainty had begun to press against her carefully arranged composure. She attempted one more explanation, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret remained seated. She did not look away. She did not intervene. The truth had already been revealed. Anything further would only dilute it. Thomas Green stepped quietly toward the event coordinator and spoke in low, practical tones about billing adjustments and contractual clauses. Life, even at moments like this, continued to require logistics. After several long seconds, Daniel extended his hand toward Olivia, not in celebration but in invitation for a private conversation. She hesitated, then accepted it. Together, they walked toward a side corridor that led away from the reception hall, their figures gradually disappearing beyond the doorway. The guests exhaled. Collectively, the room settling into a subdued murmur. Margaret rose slowly from her chair. She did not chase them. She did not defend herself further. She simply adjusted the edge of her scarf and walked toward the terrace overlooking the vineyard. Outside, the early evening sun cast long golden shadows across the rows of vines, and the air felt cooler against her skin. Behind her, the reception hall remained suspended between what had been planned and what now must be faced. Margaret stood at the railing, her back straight, her reflection faintly visible in the glass doors. She had not demanded control. She had only refused silence. And in doing so, she had shifted the course of the day without raising her voice. Margaret remained on the terrace for several minutes, her hands resting lightly on the wooden railing as the sky shifted from gold to a softer shade of early evening blue. Behind her, the low murmur of guests carried through the open doors, subdued but steady, as though everyone was waiting for a signal about what would happen next. She did not turn immediately when she heard footsteps approach. She recognized Daniel's stride before he spoke. It had been the same stride he used as a teenager when he was trying to appear confident while hiding uncertainty. He stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, yet not quite. For a moment neither of them spoke. The vineyard stretched out in front of them, endless rows aligned with quiet precision, a reminder that growth required patience and careful tending. Daniel finally exhaled slowly. He said he had asked Olivia directly about the key card, about the late hour, about the silence that followed. He said her answers had shifted, small details changing with each explanation. Margaret listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not say "I told you so." She did not say "I warned you." She simply asked one question in a steady voice. "Do you feel at peace with what you heard?" Daniel did not respond right away. His silence was answer enough. Inside the reception hall, a few guests had quietly resumed their seats. Some spoke in hushed tones. Others chose to step outside for air, careful not to intrude on the private conversation unfolding on the terrace. The celebration had not ended, but it had transformed into something more reflective, more honest. Daniel turned toward his mother, searching her face for anger and finding none. What he saw instead was resolve. He admitted he had overlooked small signs in recent months, dismissing moments of tension as wedding stress. He said he wanted to believe everything was perfect because perfection was easier than doubt. Margaret nodded once. "Belief is not the same as truth," she replied calmly. Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity shaped by years of experience. After another long pause, Daniel said he needed time. Not an hour. not a conversation over dinner. Time to reconsider promises that had been spoken only minutes earlier. Margaret placed a gentle hand over his for the first time that day. The gesture was steady, reassuring, not controlling. "Take the time you need," she said. A lifetime should not be rushed because of one afternoon. Behind them, the terrace doors opened again. Olivia stepped outside, her gown gathered slightly at the hem, her expression no longer composed. She looked from Daniel to Margaret and then back again, as though trying to measure the distance that had quietly formed. She spoke softly, asking if they could return inside, if they could continue the evening without further embarrassment. The word embarrassment lingered in the air. Margaret did not respond to it. Daniel did. He said that what had happened was not about embarrassment. It was about trust. His tone was not harsh, but it was firm in a way that suggested a boundary had been drawn. Olivia's shoulders lowered, the confidence that had carried her through the day fading beneath the weight of consequence. Margaret stepped back slightly, giving them space. This was no longer her decision to make. She had revealed the truth, and nothing more. The vineyard breeze lifted the edge of her scarf gently, cool against her skin. Inside the hall, the music remained silent, waiting. On the terrace, beneath the open California sky, a young marriage stood at a crossroads, and a mother stood steady, having chosen dignity over silence when it mattered most. The terrace grew quieter as the last streaks of sunlight dipped behind the rolling hills, casting the vineyard in a calm blue dusk. Daniel stood facing Olivia, the distance between them no longer measured in feet, but in certainty. Margaret remained slightly apart, her presence steady but unobtrusive, allowing the decision to settle where it belonged. After several long moments, Daniel spoke with a clarity that carried beyond emotion. He said that a marriage could survive stress, disagreements, even misunderstandings, but it could not begin with deception. His words were not loud, yet they held weight. Olivia's eyes glistened under the terrace lights, her earlier confidence replaced by something far more uncertain. She said she had acted out of insecurity, that she had felt overshadowed, that she had convinced herself it was a harmless act meant to shift attention. The explanation sounded smaller than the action it attempted to justify. Daniel listened fully, but the silence that followed her confession spoke louder than either of them. Inside the reception hall, guests had begun to gather their belongings quietly, sensing that the celebration would not resume as planned. The band remained seated, instruments resting idle on their laps. Staff members exchanged restrained glances, awaiting instruction. Thomas Green stood near the entrance, already speaking in low tones with the venue manager about revised arrangements. Margaret watched her son carefully. She saw the boy she had raised, the man he had become, and the crossroads before him. When Daniel finally turned toward her, his expression was no longer confused. It was resolved. He said the reception would end. He said vows spoken hours earlier required truth to sustain them, and until that truth was fully restored, there would be no honeymoon, no continuation of celebration. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the consequence. There was no dramatic outburst, no scene. Only the quiet collapse of an image that had been carefully constructed. Margaret stepped forward then, not to speak over anyone, but to place a steady hand on Daniel's arm. The gesture carried reassurance rather than triumph. She told him that endings were not failures when they prevented deeper wounds. Her voice remained calm, measured, almost gentle. The terrace lights flickered on automatically as evening settled fully over the vineyard. One by one, guests exited the hall, offering Daniel subdued embraces and nods of understanding. Some approached Margaret with quiet respect, their expressions reflecting recognition of her composure. She did not seek validation. She simply accepted each acknowledgement with grace. As the parking lot slowly emptied and the hum of conversation faded into the cool California night, Margaret untied the silk scarf and folded it carefully in her hands. The breeze touched her shortened hair without ceremony. She did not hide it now. She did not need to. Daniel stood beside her, no longer a groom celebrating perfection, but a man who had chosen clarity over illusion. The vineyard remained unchanged, rows of vines stretching patiently into the darkness, ready for another season of growth. Margaret looked out across the landscape and felt no bitterness, only certainty. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had not retaliated with cruelty. She had revealed truth and trusted it to do what it always does when given light. And in that quiet strength, she understood that dignity, once claimed, could not be taken away again.